Great. All right, so welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Shreya Saxena, who's our final speaker of this Colloquium series on neural engineering. And she's visiting us from the University of Florida, where she's an assistant professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. And her work is a great example of applying tools and principles of engineering, like control theory and AI, to questions in biological systems and neuroscience in particular. And so with that, I will hand it off to her. Great.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Amy, for having me here, and all of you for coming. I understand it's the last week of classes, so whoever is here, they made a great effort to come, so thank you. And yes, as Amy said, my work deals with the computational principles of neuroscience. Specifically, this talk is going to be about the neural control of movement and the computational principles behind that. My lab generally deals with modeling high-dimensional neural activity and behavior, and in general, with a specific focus and interest in movement. Okay, so let's get started. So as I said, today I'm going to talk about neuro AI in general for motor control, and specifically about generalization. So our brain, in general, they're pretty special as compared to networks, right? So we can perform many tasks, and once we've learned a task, we can also perform it, for example, at a different speed, slightly different speed, without any problem. We can speed it up, slow it down, and also kind of do a slightly different task with no learning time needed. So it's very good at this kind of generalization. And networks in general are not as good at it. So how do we actually learn more flexibly and generalize, and how can we generalize to newer movements or different conditions in a more flexible way? So that's going to be the first part of my talk. And the second part actually deals with how we can understand generalization across subjects. So if I'm doing a task, there are many commonalities between how I do it and how someone else, one of you, for example, might do that same task. It is quite difficult to understand which principles in neuroscience actually remain similar throughout this, through this process of doing the same task across different subjects, and which principles change. So I'll touch on how we're dealing with this in my lab. And I'm a relatively new PI, so I'd love feedback from all of you to help refine the lab's goals as time goes on. So please feel free to ask questions and have comments during the talk as well as afterwards. Okay, how are we thinking about these two generalization problems? We're actually explicitly building in constraints to achieve generalization and also understand how the networks are actually performing. So I'll talk about all of these throughout the talk. Okay, so let's get started with the first part. So I'm looking at generalization across conditions. So I want you to consider the case, for example, cycling. If you have already learned how to cycle, you can flexibly perform that cycling movement slower or faster, with some bounds, of course. But once you've learned, you are able to speed up or slow down pretty flexibly. Now, it's actually a hard-ish problem on the level of your muscles. Your muscles are not just contracting faster, but they actually have different patterns of activity if you want to go slower or faster. And I'll show you a little bit of data about how that actually works. But somewhere in the brain, somewhere presumably in the motor cortex, there lies a representation of what the muscles should be doing at a slower or faster level, right? So something is controlling these muscles. And I've already brought in the word control here as a foreshadowing of what we're going to be talking about. But basically, there needs to be somewhere in the brain that can have a continuous representation of how the speed maps into different muscle activity depending on how fast you're going. So is this in the motor cortex? How exactly is it happening? That's what the first part will be about. So to examine this kind of a question, colleagues at Columbia University collected, recorded data from 2 monkeys that are cycling through a virtual environment. So this here, what you're seeing is a monkey performing a task cycling with its forelimb. And the cycling motion produces a forward movement in this virtual environment that the monkey is able to see. Depending on the color of the landscape, the monkey also can cycle backwards to produce the same forward movement. That's kind of a controlled setup. But the important part is actually that the monkey's speed is continuously changing as it tracks this, this moving object. So the moving object can actually go faster or slower, so the monkey's speed continuously changes in order to match that. So, so we have access to a lot of different kinds of speeds and kinds of movements as this monkey is tracking this object. And so first, first I will just address that, yes, there were recordings made from the motor cortex and muscle activity, intramuscular EMG, in order to examine that, the task and how the brain actually does it. So we first take a look at the muscle activity, muscle first. So this is the activity of one of the muscles. Sorry if it's not as bright, actually. But anyway, this is the activity of one of the muscles, the deltoid, during forward cycling. And we first chop it up into bins, right? So this happens to be the slowest movement that the monkey makes. And the fastest one looks like this. So as you can see, this is not just going faster, but actually a slightly different pattern, right? It is a higher amplitude. And we have many different kinds of muscles that actually change their pattern even more drastically than this. So it's not just contracting in time, but there's more going on. And similarly, we have all the other speeds. And again, you can see there are different patterns of activity that they actually occupy during all these speeds. So this was the muscles, right? This was one muscle that I just showed you. There are many other muscles that are recorded. Again, different patterns of activity are visible as the speed changes flexibly. So where in the brain can we actually figure out which muscle pattern do we need to make in order to go at a particular speed? So the colleagues also recorded from the motor cortex, as I mentioned, and our goal will be to figure out, can we understand motor cortical activity just by knowing the behavior? So just by knowing the task and the behavior. So we want to predict, in some sense, what the neural activity will look like. That will give us an understanding of what the neural activity is actually doing. Okay, so it turns out that we can't actually predict single neuron activity very well just by knowing the muscles activity. So single neurons don't actually encode for single muscles, don't actually encode single neurons. So we can't do this inverse activity or exercise where we can go from single muscles to single neurons. Doesn't prove to be very successful. So there's more going on. But although this didn't actually hold true in this data set, the encoding hypothesis kind of gives us a very nice predictive tool of how do we actually understand neural activity very cleanly. So how do we get clear predictions about neural activity given behavior? So I'll tell you about one of the studies that we did, which is actually train a goal-driven recurrent neural network. So basically a neural network that actually produces muscle activity, in this case because we know that the output is muscle activity. So that's why the goal-driven is that we know that the motor cortex produces muscle activity, so we train a neural network to actually produce it and see post hoc what the actual neural network activity looks like and how that relates to the neural data. So this is now the muscle activity in PC, in principal component space, so just a lower dimensional space. You can see that, so for example, here the slowest versus fastest speeds look quite different from each other. And I'm not sure if you see it very well. The difference in colors is not showing up on these slides as much as it does on the laptop. But basically, there is a gradient. It looks kind of messy in lower dimensional space. And what about the neural network that was actually trained to produce this activity? So we train it to produce this activity given a speed input, which is hypothesized inputs to the motor cortex. And there, the activity looks a lot cleaner. It looks a lot more well distributed. We trained a lot of different networks, and they all adopted this kind of a shape. I can go through why we think that is. But basically, this kind of activity is more well spread out. We can actually move through the space in something like a speed axis to be able to produce different kinds of motor cortical activity, which then we think produces the muscle activity. Now, is this a good model of the motor cortex? Right now, we haven't actually looked at that, right? This is just a model that produces muscle activity. But to be able to relate it to neural activity, what we can do is try to decode neural activity given just the neural network, the nodes activity. Okay, so that here we did exactly that. We used this trained model's activity to decode the firing rate of single neurons. And it actually works really well. So the RNN fit is in green here. And you can see that it works very much better than our control, which is just taking the EMG activity and trying to decode neural activity. So there's something more going on in the network that can actually help us understand neural activity better. And that is being captured using this input-output model, in this case, going from speed to the EMG. Okay, so I've told you that this model outputs EMG activity very well. It actually reconstructs neural data really well. What more do we need from this model in order to understand how the motor cortex works? And that is that interpretability, that explainability of how the model is doing what it does. So in order to tell you where we went from there, I'm going to just zoom out a little bit first. So the goal-driven recurrent neural network framework, or just the goal-driven framework, is a framework that tells you, okay, if I can emulate the same task that the motor cortex is doing, then I should be able to understand the motor cortex a little bit better. So what is the task that the motor cortex is doing? It's not just producing muscle activity, but it's actually using feedback and producing muscle activity flexibly enough to be able to generalize it to new conditions, right? So it's in a way, it's driving the musculoskeletal system to actually produce different kinds of activity, not just a pattern generator, right? So it's using feedback signals and planning ahead in order to produce activity through, very importantly, this musculoskeletal system that's in the loop, right? The muscles don't just act in a silo, they actually innervate limbs, which have their own dynamics. And that concept of the limbs, the musculoskeletal system, having its own dynamics and being driven by something external, that is a concept that has been studied in electrical engineering for a long time. So control theory. There's some, if you've taken controls classes, there's something called a plant, usually, that is driven by something that you design, and in this case, a controller. So this concept, the motor pathways being a controller for the musculoskeletal system, that is a relatively new concept in at least motor control, which has been thought of in the past very deeply, but not actually applied to neural activity as clearly. And so that's what we hope to do in this study. So the motor pathways here can be actually thought of as very cleanly as a controller for this dynamical system that is the musculoskeletal system. So where does that lead us, this concept? Okay, so we are going to basically first model the musculoskeletal system, because that is the thing that we're trying to control here using our neural signals. And then model it in the loop, in the feedback loop, in order to actually understand its principles a little bit better. So the first step, modeling the musculoskeletal system. So a grad student in my lab has been very involved in the study. His name's Noman. And he firstly, to begin even thinking about this project, we have to come up with the model for the musculoskeletal system for the monkey, because that's the recordings that we have. That's our model system. And so he first adapted a known model in OpenSim. I'm not sure who here has worked with biomechanical models, but OpenSim is a very good open source software for biomechanical models. However, it's very anatomically realistic, but that makes it a bit slow. So in order to speed up these computations, and I'll tell you why later, but basically we need this model to be fast in order to learn the controller to actually drive it. So we first adopted Mojoko as our system, or physically, it's a physics-based simulation system that was recently bought by DeepMind, so it's also open source now. So that was really lucky for us. But yeah, basically we adopted Mojoko as our physics-based simulation software and optimized our monkey model to be applicable, to be able to be run in Mojoko. Now that we've done that, so this is actually a 39 muscle, sorry, this is advancing a little too fast, 39 muscle monkey arm. So we want to train, we have learned that a recurrent neural network works pretty well to emulate the motor cortex. So we want to train an RNN to provide muscle activations that actually are driven by feedback signals from the task itself. Okay, so muscle activations here are the output, feedback signals are the input to our RNN. How do you train an RNN in this kind of a setting? Deep reinforcement learning is actually a really good, well-studied framework to train models, to train networks that are nonlinear in order to produce complex signals. So here we have a 39-dimensional output, which is a lot, and the feedback also is quite high dimensional because it's getting feedback from all the muscles as well as the task itself, the target itself. So, so we use the DRL framework in order to train this RNN, but basically this RNN was trained to track the kinematics that were actually experimentally produced by the monkey and trained to also minimize muscle effort. So we can build in a pretty flexible reward function in order to actually train this, which is really nice. And we can also, of course, train it for multiple tasks, which we are just getting to, so I don't have any results on that yet, but that's where we're going with this. But firstly, so here, what we did was train it for the cycling task that I told you about. So we have three of the speeds that the monkey cycled at. We trained this model to flexibly, to be able to produce those speeds and to actually produce the experimentally recorded kinematics. So now, this is a model that can produce experimentally recorded movements. So this is now, again, a goal-driven model for the neural activity, which is what we examine next. But firstly, the kinematics. So this arm now kind of tracks a moving target in space. And this may not seem very impressive to you, but it does look a lot like the monkey's movements. So this is the monkey itself doing the same task. The model itself is slowed down to be able to see it well. But yeah, they're doing the task at the same speed. And now we have a model that we can look at. The model itself will be the RNN that we'll examine. Now, again, this may not look super impressive to you because it's just moving, cycling along. But I want you to remember that it had to learn how to do this using a 39-dimensional space. And 39 is not even the actual number of dimensions, and it's not the real number of muscles that we actually use. But again, we want to work with something a little simpler. And just to relate it back to what we do as humans, when we're learning, so I just had a kid 2 months ago, and I can see so well that this thing is like learning motor movements, and I'll show you where they start. So this is my child learning motor movements. Sorry, I skipped over it way too fast. There you go. So he's just making random movements, right? That's where the model starts out as well. When it's starting to train, that's what it's doing, just completely random movements. And so having that as a sort of starting point and then getting to very controlled movements, it takes a long time. So even for the DRL framework, it takes a long time to actually get here. But we're going to get more complicated as time goes on. Hopefully my kid will also learn slightly more controlled movements as time goes on. Okay, so where are we at? So I showed you that it can actually output accurate kinematics. I didn't show the accurate part, but this is hopefully it gives you an idea. You can't really even see the dashed lines here because it is actually able to produce the kinematics really well. So that's great. Now, I had also told you that we want to examine the relationship to the motor cortex, right? That was the point of even training this network. So it actually does fit neural population dynamics really well, and we do this through canonical correlation analysis. We can actually see which subset of the network activity fits the neural activity really well in a lower dimensional space, and I can go through the details there if anyone would like. Okay, so that's showing you sort of that network reconstruction as compared to the PC, the principal component space that we had seen earlier. And it also predicts single neuron firing rates really well. So this is on a held out speed that the DRL framework has seen, but we use a linear regression to actually figure out how to relate the network activity to the neural activity. That's a linear regression, and the linear regressor has not seen this speed. Okay, that's fine, that's good. What about generalization to unseen conditions that the DRL framework has not seen? And actually that works really well as well. So here, this is a new speed, right? So one that the DRL framework has not seen. And we can actually even reconstruct that really well across both the network activity, so the neural population activity, as well as single neuron firing rates. Okay, so that's what we were looking for. It is actually much better at doing that than other methods that people have used in the past, including myself, where we can, for example, train an RNN to decode muscle activity. That's what I had shown you earlier. So that's a pattern generator method where you're just training the RNN to predict muscle activity. It can actually, so here on the x-axis, you see that RNN decode. And on the y-axis, you see the DRL controller that we've trained, and each dot is a neuron. And for the kind of something that the DRL framework has seen, it can produce really good sort of R-squareds per neuron, but something that the RNN has seen as well will also produce pretty good R-squareds. So that's actually close to this dotted line is actually then our DRL controls aren't doing too much better. But as soon as you get to an unseen speed that the RNN hasn't seen and the DRL controller hasn't seen either, that's when you start to see that our DRL controller is doing much better. So an unseen speed that's close to the speeds that we trained on, it does very well. And an unseen speed that's far from the speeds that we've trained on, it also continues to do really well. And I think that is basically because we have built-in anatomical and biophysical knowledge about how the musculoskeletal activity works and what it is actually trying to do, what the RNN is actually trying, what the brain is actually trying to do. We have built that knowledge in. And so now the generalization ability of this network is going to be much better. And that's what we're seeing in our experiments and our studies as well. Great, so we can actually predict single neuron firing rates through this in unseen conditions. So that's the generalization. And lastly, we can also actually understand these computations using perturbations. So if you perturb an RNN, yes, you can see how it evolves, but you can only see that in muscle space if you're only outputting muscle activity. What about the feedback? What about the actual kinematics? How does the limb actually move? All of that is not possible without this kind of a framework. So we can actually perturb the network, we can perturb the feedback, we can perturb we can apply muscle forces in our simulation and see how that evolves. And the feedback is supposed to help. So here we can actually model how exactly that looks and how exactly that helps. So that builds in a level of explainability in these networks, which was not possible before. So that's where the explainability comes in, and the generalization is also through this kind of building in knowledge in these kinds of networks. Okay, and I'm really interested in applications towards rehabilitation, which I haven't really looked at yet with these networks. But that's something that, again, that's very easy to do. We can actually build that in, understand how these the network activity changes if the muscles are not working as well anymore. So how exactly that the network should adapt, and consequently how maybe the brain adapts to for example, losses in the muscle activity. That kind of thing is very easy now to look at through this framework. So I'm excited to do that in the future. Okay, I just want to briefly ask if there are any questions, because I'm going to change tracks here and go a little bit into the across-subject studies that we've been looking at. So any questions either? I don't know if there's a Zoom thing, which is hybrid, or in person. Yeah, Amy.
I'm curious if you could talk a little more about what the feedback signals are in the network.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really go into what they are. So so we're looking at the muscle, so the proprioception signals usually, right? So how this, how the force changes, the length actually changes. So these kinds of basically proprioceptive signals that the brain also gets, not necessarily the motor cortex, but through a lot of other areas to eventually the motor cortex. So these proprioceptive signals, as well as the task itself, like what the monkey is supposed to be seeing. Now, we haven't actually done it, so we're going towards is also incorporating the virtual landscape into this. We haven't actually done that yet, but so we're assuming that the monkey's like literally seeing its arm right now, but we'll get there. We'll get to the virtual landscape as well, which is a part of the task itself, if you remember. So yeah, so kinematics, target kinematics, and muscle proprioceptive activity. Yeah, thanks. Good question. Yes?
Do you see that the aura framework you use to train as a good mechanism to maybe simulate how it learns under perturbation?
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear all of that.
Maybe try to speak a little louder. Like the RL framework that you use to train the
Yeah.
network, do you see it when, say, applied during perturbation as maybe it would tell us how the animal should be actually learning under perturbation as well?
Yeah. So that's a great question. We want to kind of make these networks more robust to perturbations while training as well, and see what the effect is on the eventual learned movement, whether they generalize a little bit better. So currently we're not building in perturbations during training, during learning at all, but that is something that we're currently running a few experiments on to see whether that actually helps with the generalization, whether it helps with robustness while recovering from an unwanted perturbation, an undesired perturbation. Yeah, so does that help your question? Okay, great, I'm happy I addressed your question. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So in the deep reinforcement learning model, you showed that it generalizes a lot better over different speeds of behavior, right? So like you showed earlier, like at the slower speeds, like the muscle dynamics themselves are actually quite different.
Yeah.
So like this is seemingly like capturing that.
Yeah.
I was wondering what approach you were going to take to try and like dissect the RNN and see like how those computations are actually being driven, like kind of the understanding of point forward there.
Yeah, the explainability, a little bit more of the actual network. So yeah, I've only talked about the explainability in the sense that if we perturb it, we can see what effect it has on the movements themselves, right? So that's the explainability that I'm thinking about. But yes, there's the network explainability, right? So what are the features of the network that actually help it achieve its goal? And I looked a bit into that so let's see. So basically what's happening, let me just pull up a backup slide. I think that'll help. There. Okay, so there are certain geometrical features that we see in the network's activity itself that we can examine very cleanly through sort of the more dynamical systems perspective. So we're actually seeing stable limit cycles being generated, but they are, so this is, for example, the network activity at one of the speeds, the slowest speed. And I'm not sure if you're able to see it, but you can basically evolve the network, starting from different initial conditions to be able to see where it ends up. So we're seeing here that it's a stable limit cycle, but the interesting thing is that it's actually an input-dependent stable limit cycle. I'm going to skip over. Yeah. So this is the network's activity through different initial conditions at all the speeds that were recorded. And you see that depending on what the input is, this limit cycle structure is slightly different. So there's basically a speed axis that you can control, and that kind of determines where you'll end up in this space and which limit cycle you'll be in. So it's basically an input-dependent stable limit cycle that the network seems to be adopting. And the same is true for a DRL framework, but it's a slightly different, the inputs are different to our network. So it takes a little, we're still analyzing the exact structure that leads to the exact sort of computation that leads to this structure, because there's no longer the speed input that I had discussed earlier. So yeah, but that's a great question. So what about sort of trying to understand how the network itself is able to perform the task? So we think it is the stable limit cycle idea, but the inputs are slightly different to our DRL framework. So we're still getting there in trying to examine that question, but thank you. Okay, so now I'll get to a little more of the across subject studies, and if anyone has any questions about the first part later on, go ahead after the talk as well. Okay, so the across subject studies. The general idea here is that we're trying to examine how different subjects are able to perform the same task. And what similarities do they have in their neural activity while they are performing a very similar task. Okay, so I'll get to what exactly I mean. So we've been concentrating on the motor cortex in the first part, right? But there are a lot of other areas that actually lead to complex behavior. A lot of areas that are connected to the motor cortex that actually lead to complex behavior. So here I'm showing you some large-scale neural data, which is not showing up very well on the screen, but it's supposed to be all bright and all the different regions in the brain are lighting up. And that's to show you actually that during a task, during a fairly motor-driven task, there are a lot of different areas in the brain that are actually lighting up. There are a lot of them that are leading to a complex sort of motor activity. So how do we examine what the relationship is from these different regions to the actual behavior? So here I'm showing you, this is now a rodent study, not monkeys anymore, but these are mice, where they're performing a task that is, that's basically a two alternative force choice task for those who know what that means, but they're just looking at a visual stimulus, either to the left or the right, and then there's a delay, and then they have to lick the spout that corresponds to which direction they think the stimulus is coming from. So this is, the spout that they lick, they lick the spout that they think, is left or right, depending on which stimulus they think it is. So it's a very simple task, but the motor activity that is needed, they also have to press a lever in order to start the task and things like that. The motor activity that's needed is quite complex. And you can see correspondingly that a lot of different regions, including visual, because they're getting that feedback, but a lot of different regions in the brain light up during this kind of a task. Now, how do different subjects actually perform this task, and what do they have in common? That kind of question first has to start from the behavior itself. So we want to see whether the neural activity actually produces the behavior in a very similar way across different subjects. But first we have to examine the commonalities in the behavior itself in order to actually get at that question. Because if we don't know that the behavior is very similar, how do we actually build models that kind of try to understand how this relationship is preserved across different subjects? Okay, so I'll concentrate a lot on the behavior for the first part and then get to this question, is this relationship preserved across subjects? Okay, so how do we do it first with just one subject? So this, how do we analyze the behavior with just one subject? Here I'm showing that there were two views of the task that were actually recorded simultaneously of the mouse doing the task. This is one mouse, right? Now, we are looking at it first from a dimensionality reduction point of view. So we want to figure out how this behavior was generated, but it's very high dimensional, so let's just compress it first. So we use a convolutional autoencoder to do that. we get some latents out. These latent variables are basically the representation of the behavior now. And these latents are lower dimensional, so they're much easier to actually decode or build models that will decode that behavior. And then, of course, once we have latent activity, we can push it through this decoder of the autoencoder in order to produce the entire video again and understand what that means. Okay, so that's what we do. So we've, oh, oops, sorry. I might as well just use this. There you go. Yeah, so we first train this autoencoder, and then use neural activity to decode the latent variables themselves that then you can push through the decoder in order to figure out what the decode was of the neural activity. Okay, so there are two steps to this. One is autoencoder, one is the decoder from the neural activity. Okay, so first I'll just show you the results for one subject, right? How good are we able to actually, how well are we able to do this? So this is one subject, and this is the autoencoder that was trained to produce this behavior itself. So it goes literally from the behavior to the behavior. We're just compressing the representation, right? So we expect this to do well. Here, the surprising part is that it only takes 8 latent variables to actually produce a really high-dimensional video really well. That's because convolutional autoencoders are good at what they do. They have already been figured out. So 8 latent variables. And now we can train this decoder to actually produce a latent variable activity. And we actually get a really good decode just from the neural activity. This was surprising because we didn't actually know what kind of signals are in this neural activity. Just to tell you a little bit more about the neural activity, this is wide-field calcium imaging recordings. So wide-field calcium imaging takes a view of the entire dorsal cortex of the mouse, but a projected view of that. So the upside is you get a lot of different regions in your field of view. The downside is you don't get single neuron activity, you get kind of a population activity in every pixel. So this is wide field calcium activity, and we weren't actually sure how much signal is in here, how much information related to the movements is in here. But through this exercise, we can actually see that we can reconstruct a really good part of the behavior through just the neural activity. So that was sort of our goal here, to give us insight into how much information is here. This is in black, the predicted latent variables that are actually pushed through the decoder to reconstruct this video. Okay, so this is for one mouse, right? Now, in order to examine the commonalities in this decoder, what we first need to do is actually put all of the behavior in the same latent space in order to then have a decode, right? So here, just this autoencoder needs to be adapted for multiple subjects, and that will actually involve first figuring out the commonalities in behavior across these subjects, and then figuring out the neural decode. So I'll show you how we're thinking about that. So how can we actually model the similarities in behavior in these subjects while the same task is performed? So in these videos, you'll see that there are parts of the behavior which are very similar across these mice, and other parts which are very different. Of course, you can, well, a good eye will be able to tell that these are different mice, right? You can see image level or image level differences in these mice, especially this one. This one's a little bit different from the others. So we want to cast all that aside, the image level differences, in order to capture the similarities in the actual movements that they're doing. So the actual movements, of course, are actually quite similar. You know, they're moving their paws to the lever, they're licking the spout, they're kind of moving their jaws in order to lick the spout. Now, there are a lot of commonalities in the behavior, but we want to partition out the commonalities, the similarities in the behavior, from the differences, which are image level differences. Okay, So that's exactly what we do through a convolutional neural network. So this is, again, an autoencoder, which basically takes the image itself and tries to reconstruct the image using the most compressed representation possible. But now we want some latent variables that are actually across subject, and those are the common latent variables across all these subjects, and which we want them to be different from the image level differences, which are kind of subject-specific latent variables. And of course, there's also the possibility that some parts of the behavior are only present in some subjects, so that will also be captured in these latent variables, and we'll hopefully be left with things that are common across every subject here. That's our goal, to partition out this latent space. So another grad student in my lab has been working on exactly that. So here we're using 3 parts to this convolutional autoencoder. This subject-specific latents specifically are what we are interested in modeling. And the idea is once we can model the differences, the rest is all common, right? The rest is across subjects. So here we try to model the differences very clearly. And that's using a Cauchy-Schwarz regularizer to do that, which will basically help these latents be cast into a prior distribution that helps separate out the latents as much as possible, or encourages separation. And I can go into the details there for anyone who's interested. And basically, the rest of the latents can now be, a common regularizer for the rest of them, and a variational autoencoder is a KL divergence. And that kind of encourages all the latents to be close together and close to normal distribution. So that acts on a subset of the latents, and a subset of the latents are also enforced to produce any tracked labels that we have on these subjects. So in this case, for example, we can track their body part locations using software like DeepLabCut, if anyone has heard of that here. But basically, DeepLabCut and other kinds of pose estimation software can actually do a really good job of producing the right, the body parts that are in the field of view, but they miss the smaller muscles, right? They miss, like, if the jaw is moving, for example, it's really hard to track the jaw, actually. So they miss the chest, jaw, like all these different kinds of things. And so that's why we have a set of latents that can capture those smaller movements, and another set of latents that can actually capture the body part locations as well. So we have everything in this one autoencoder setup. Okay, but our goal is to partition out the subject-specific activity from the across-subject activity. So how well do we do there? So first of all, we can actually, the first sanity check is to reconstruct all the subject's behavior. So at the top, you see the original videos. The bottom, you see the reconstructions, and yeah, they're able to capture a lot, all of the movements really well, so that's great. We're able to capture all mice's activity. Now, the part we were interested in is partitioning out the across-subject latents, which are basically the commonalities in the subject's behavior, from the subject-specific latents. So now these subject-specific latents are very different across the different mice. So they are capturing the differences, which here are mainly image-related. And the cross-subjects are capturing the commonalities. So that's great. How do we quantify that? We can just try to decode which subject it is using just the latents, using a classification method. So here we just use SVM, support vector machine, to do that. And we see that the subject-specific latents, as you can see it pretty well here, are able to be decoded really well. And this is basically what we were trying to set out to do, but we did it in an unsupervised way. We didn't tell the network, okay, this is subject 1, this is subject 2. We actually just let it learn its own representation, and it encouraged separation, and that's what encouraged this network to actually learn the image level differences by itself. Okay, so that's great. And the across-subject latents can't actually decode the subjects well, which means they are now common across these entire, all of these mice. That's also good. How would a regular VAE have done it? So a regular VAE, without building in any of these constraints, actually does lead to separate representations in its latent space, which means that these representations are now not common across subjects. They are actually able to be, the latent variables themselves are able to be decoded into which subject is being represented really well, which means it doesn't capture the commonalities, right? They're all sort of different. And so you can't. So, I mean, this is literally how we started out, right? We didn't plan to go down this road, actually, but we wanted to just figure out how the neural representations are leading to the common parts of the behavior, but how do you analyze that without actually first figuring out the common parts of the behavior, right? So that's where we started, and now we can have a good representation of the common parts of the behavior. So just to sort of figure out how the CSVAE, we're calling it, the constrained subspace variational autoencoder, how it's able to actually represent these differences or similarities. And so we can actually, because it's a VAE, we can generate from the latent space, we can generate images that will help us understand how the VAE is actually functioning. So it's a generative model. We can sample the latent space in order to understand the representation that it creates. So here, for example, we're changing each latent at a time. It's called a latent traversal. We'll just change it from the min of its distribution to the max of its distribution while leaving all the other latents constant. And so if we take a base image and we then try to just change one latent at a time, we can see the difference here in this image. And again, the colors are not as obvious. I'm sorry about that. But if you can see like green spots here, the green spots are the things that are changing in this image. So the spout is one thing that we tracked, for example, using Deep Lab Cut. And that latent is able to really be localized and represent just the spout activity in the image. So that's good. Another across-subject variable is chest activity, and that includes the jaw as well. But here, if you're able to see, this jaw and chest is changing pretty locally as we change that latent. And that was an unsupervised latent, no tracking required for that. And then finally, the subject-specific latent actually takes a base image that is one mouse and changes it to another mouse. So mouse one, if we just change the subject-specific, the Cauchy-Schwarz regularized latent is able to be changed to mouse two. Mouse two is able to be changed to mouse four. And actually, we can go from any mouse to any other mouse. This latent just happened to just produce mouse two and mouse four. But those latents are now able to map one mouse into a completely different mouse. Just the images, right? So now we can generate basically each mouse doing the activity of another mouse, right? So these kinds of experiments are now possible. Behavior can be really flexibly modeled across different subjects, and that includes how the first subject is doing, making its movements, and how so basically we can make a mouse do whatever movement we actually wanted to that any other mouse is doing. I was told I should ignore that, so I'm going to do that. Okay, now what about the actual behavioral syllables, so motifs, for example. So here, I'm just showing you 3 dogs barking. They're very different breeds, right? So you expect there to be differences in the actual image, but they're all barking. So we want to be able to capture this idea that they're actually producing very common behavior, but just doing them, there are different breeds actually doing that. So we want to uncover common behavioral motifs, and that now includes dynamical activity. So I'll show you a bunch of ethograms. I'm not sure how many of you have seen that, but these are basically a set of actions or behavioral motifs carried out by an animal over time. So it'll be a time axis and what behavioral motif that they are actually performing. And like I said, you can kind of tell by eye that all of these are barking. But in a network, it's actually kind of difficult to do that, to uncover that all of them are carrying out the same action. But we have achieved that using this CSVAE network. And how we are capturing that, we are using a switched linear dynamical system in order to actually characterize the motifs, the behavioral motifs, and that basically involves clustering the activity using a dynamical model, using a linear dynamical system, but the switches, which are captured by a hidden Markov model, kind of basically capture the discrete states that the behavior is occupying over time. This was supposed to be helpful. If it's not, then just ignore that. We're just basically using a standard model to capture the changes in behavior over time. Okay. So if we just use a standard VAE, as I'd shown you before, with the latents being quite well separated, that actually obviously doesn't actually work in recovering across subject behavioral motifs. So if you try to put that through a standard motif discovery tool like the SLDS, you will get motifs that are just applicable to one mouse, like we're doing here. So that mouse is we're not able to see the commonalities between these two mice, for example, at all, because the latents themselves are very well separated. And we're also seeing that here, these motifs, state 1, state 2, these are the states that we think the mouse is going through. This is the ethogram, so these are the different states in different colors. And basically, this state 3 is only present in one mouse. State 1 is largely present in one mouse as well. Like, it's just that each mouse has its own states. That's what it looks like. But we know by eye that's not true. There are a lot of commonalities in behavior. And so the CSVAE that we have, that I just went over, recovers these across-subject behavioral motifs really well. So we can first validate this motif discovery using ground truth and equipment. So we also have, equipment sensors, like when the spouts went in, when the levers went in, when their paws touched the lever, like things like that. So we can use those in order to just validate, first of all, our motifs. And we see actually that the across-subject motifs are really well recovered, close to the ground truth, but also very similar across mice. So that's the great part about this. We can now have the same representation across different mice in latent space. And we also see, using a histogram, that very similar frequency of these states are present in each mouse. So I just want you to focus on how similar these are across different mice. Okay, so we can do that. Now, we also recover cross-subject behavioral motifs in things where we don't have ground truth, but we can actually see at least that the level of the frequency of these occurring across all the different mice is very similar. And that's actually expected in a task where the mice are doing, again, the same task, so they're moving their paws in a pretty similar way, across different mice. Great, so that's also good. We can also discover motifs that are different, different across these mice. So for example, some of these mice groom more than others. So a grooming motif is recovered, and you see that mouse 1 and 4 groom a lot more than mouse 2 and 3. But now they're all in the same space, so we can actually recover what kind of behavioral differences and similarities are actually present in the videos. Okay, I should speed up. We can also actually, the point of, a large part of the point of what all of this was, is to figure out the representation, a neural representation of how these behaviors are being performed. So we can actually basically have a common model for how the neural activity is transformed into behavior. So for each of these mouse, now that the behavior is in the same space, the commonalities of the behavior in the same space, we can fit neural activity, we can build decoders from the neural activity all the way to the behavior through a common model. So that's the representation. And that common model can actually be transformed to a novel mouse without it having without the decoder having seen any of the novel mouse's data. So that's something that would not have been possible without, first of all, the behavior representation, but also if there were no commonalities in the neural representations, this would have been impossible. And we can, so this is a concept also used in machine learning, transfer learning, where you learn first a model on different tasks, but then transfer it over to a new task. Here, the new task is a novel mouse. So that's what we're looking at here. And as compared to individual training, we're seeing, not only in the limited data regime, not only is the transfer learning method able to learn the model faster, but also slightly more accurately. But the faster is what we were going for. Okay, so that was trying to understand the commonalities in behavior and also the neural representations that actually lead to the behavior. So hopefully some of that has gotten through. And how can we actually now apply this kind of behavioral analysis tool to other settings? I want to study a lot more of naturalistic behaviors. So in neuroscience, I think the field even is moving towards basically trying to understand how subjects move in their own naturalistic environment instead of constrained task settings. And that's sort of the goal of neuroscience as well, right? Like, how do we perform movements that are more naturalistic, that are in a setting that is not as constrained by equipment? So, for example, that includes freely moving animals. So this is a rodent study, but it's kind of a social behavior study where the mice are just kind of moving in an environment. This is typically pretty hard to model. Even the behavior is pretty hard to model. So we can apply tools such as the one I just talked about to partition out individual latents from social latents, for example. So now these latents actually encode for the social behavior across these animals. Again, I'm not going to go into how they do that, but we would cover basically, we can successfully partition the behavior into individual versus social. So that's in an unsupervised way. So that's what we're going towards. And my lab in general, again, works with modeling high-dimensional data in both neural activity as well as behavior in order to gain insight into how the brain works, and also in order to build control strategies in closed loop with the neural activity. We haven't gotten to the closed loop part, so that's, again, forthcoming, but I'd love to be able to go into that. Okay, and the research focus spans, like you've seen before, data science, machine learning, and controls. With that, I want to acknowledge lab members who have joined. Amy and I were talking before this. So we've all joined during the pandemic, so we're still getting to know each other, but we're definitely into the school spirit. UF is a Gator community, so that's what you're seeing here. So these are lab members, which I'm very grateful to have excellent lab members, and collaborators as well. So most of the data that you saw today came from the labs of Mark Schirschlin with the monkey studies and Anne Schirschlin for the rodent studies. And I also wanted to acknowledge my funding here. And thank you all for actually making it during the finals week or close to finals week, and for your questions. And I will take questions. I know there's not much time, and I'm sorry about that. But I'm happy we got a couple in the middle.
So I have one question.
Yes.
On your subject-specific behavioral analysis, if I understand the tasks and the kind of data you're analyzing, these are sort of after animals know the behavior really well.
Yes.
They're very well trained. I'm super
Yes.
curious to hear your thoughts on how these kinds of approaches would generalize or think about learning.
Yeah.
Right? So even within a subject, how things evolve over time.
Yes, and that is exactly what we're looking at right now. So I'm very excited to talk to you about that potentially later, because there's not as many results on that yet. But we're examining that right now. And we do see changes in behavior which are more continuous over time, right? So right now here, what we wanted out of this is for the subjects to be as well separated, the subject-specific latents to be as well separated as they could. But in the task or in a setting where we're trying to figure out continuous differences in behavior, that is where our model also performs well. And it could have, yeah, the social behavior setting also shows that actually, but continuously varying latents are also able to be well separated by this model. So that's where we're looking at learning is exactly an example of that, where over time you'll see basically changes in behavior very cleanly through this modeling process. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question.
Anyone else? Right? If not, then let's get back into